Have you ever looked at an old photograph of yourself and felt something strange? Not because you looked younger, not because your life was easier. Something else. You remember the day. You remember where you were. You remember who took the picture. You might even remember what happened a few minutes after it was taken. And then a strange thought appears. I remember this day. I just don't remember being this person. Maybe it was only 3 years ago, maybe 5, maybe even less. And yet the person in the photograph feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Like someone you used to know very well. Someone you haven't seen in a long time. Most people never talk about this feeling. They say things like, I've changed, or I'm just getting older. But that doesn't quite describe it. This feels different. Because it isn't only that your life changed. Sometimes it feels like you changed quietly while your attention was somewhere else. You became busier, more responsible, more reliable, more efficient. And one day you opened an old photograph and realized something you couldn't explain. You don't feel like yourself anymore. The strange thing is, there was never a day when you became someone else. No announcement, no dramatic moment, no clear before and after. It happened so slowly that it still felt like you, until one day it didn't. A while ago, the architect of this channel found an old photograph. Nothing unusual, just an ordinary day, an ordinary smile. And then something strange happened. He remembered the day. He remembered the place. He remembered the people. But he couldn't remember what it felt like to be that person. That feeling is probably one of the reasons this conversation exists. Becoming someone else happens so slowly that it still feels like you. Until one day, it doesn't. And when that moment arrives, the question isn't, when did I change? The question is, where did the person I remember go? Maybe it wasn't even an old photograph. Maybe it was a memory on your phone. One of those notifications that quietly appears and says, 3 years ago today. You tap it. A few pictures appear. And for a moment, everything feels normal. You remember the restaurant. You remember the trip. You remember the people. You remember what happened that day. You might even remember what happened the next day. And then something strange happens. You start looking at yourself. Not the place, not the background, not the people. Yourself. You notice the expression on your face, the way you're standing, the way you're smiling, the way you seem to occupy the moment. And a strange thought appears. I know this person, but I don't entirely recognize him. The strange thing is that nothing looks wrong. You don't necessarily look happier. You don't necessarily look younger. You don't necessarily look more successful. And yet something feels different, as if there was a version of you that moved through the world in a slightly different way. A version of you that had a different relationship with time, a different relationship with energy, a different relationship with possibility. You begin searching for evidence. What exactly changed? You can't explain it. You just know that the person in the photograph feels more familiar than the person currently holding the phone. And that thought can be strangely unsettling. Because photographs are supposed to preserve memories. Nobody tells you that sometimes they preserve versions of yourself. The architect of this channel spent longer than expected looking at one particular photograph. Nothing extraordinary was happening. No important milestone, no major achievement, no dramatic event. Just an ordinary day. And that may have been the strangest part, because he wasn't looking at a special memory. He was looking at an ordinary version of himself that no longer seemed entirely accessible. It felt less like remembering and more like meeting someone he used to know. Maybe that's why old photographs can sometimes make us unexpectedly quiet. Not because they remind us that time passed, but because they remind us that we passed through time as different people. And sometimes the most difficult question isn't, Why did my life change? Sometimes the question is, when did I stop feeling like the person I remember? The strange thing is, most people aren't trying to go back. They don't necessarily want to be 20 again. They don't necessarily want their old apartment back, or their old job, or even their old circumstances. Because if they're honest, some parts of life are better now. Some things are more stable. Some things are more meaningful. Some things are more real. And yet something still feels missing. Because when people say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," they usually aren't talking about their life. They're talking about a feeling. Maybe you used to get excited more easily. Maybe you used to become completely absorbed in things. Maybe you laughed more. Maybe you stayed up late talking to people. Maybe you had hobbies that seemed strangely important. Maybe you had ideas that felt possible. Maybe you had energy that seemed endless. You weren't necessarily happier, but you felt more available to your own life. The person you remember wasn't perfect. The person you remember was present. And maybe that's why old photographs can feel so strange, because they don't only remind you of what happened, they remind you of how it felt to exist as that version of yourself. Sometimes you miss the way ordinary evenings felt. Sometimes you miss how much curiosity you had. Sometimes you miss how easily you could become interested in something for no practical reason. Sometimes you miss the person who could spend an hour doing something that didn't need to become productive. And perhaps the strangest part is this. You often don't realize you miss these things until they're gone. Because nobody wakes up and says, "Today I became slightly less curious. Today I became slightly less playful. Today I became slightly less available to myself." It happens quietly. So quietly that years can pass before you notice anything changed. And then one evening you open an old photograph, and suddenly you're not looking at your younger self, you're looking at someone who seemed to have more access to his own mind, to his own attention, to his own energy, to his own life. And for a moment you wonder something almost impossible to answer. What happened to that person? The architect of this channel didn't look at that photograph and think, "I wish I were younger." The thought was much stranger than that. It was something closer to this. I remember being tired. I remember having problems. I remember worrying about things. So why does this person still feel more alive? That question stayed around much longer than expected. Because sometimes what we miss isn't a period of life. It's a version of ourselves that seemed easier to reach. Maybe that's why this feeling can be so difficult to explain. Because you're not grieving a place, or a year, or an opportunity. You're trying to understand why someone who used to feel so familiar now feels like somebody you once knew. People often imagine change as something dramatic. A breakup, a new job, moving to another city, having children, losing someone, a crisis, a major decision. Those moments feel important. They feel like the kinds of things that change a person. But if you think about the people you've known for a long time, that's usually not how change happens. Most people don't become someone else overnight. Most people become someone else, one small adjustment at a time. One busy season, one difficult project, one period of poor sleep, one responsibility that never goes away, one habit that quietly disappears, one friendship that slowly becomes less active, one hobby that gets postponed, one thing you stop doing because there isn't enough time. None of these moments feel important enough to change your identity, and that's exactly why they do. Because you don't argue with small changes, you adapt to them. You tell yourself, "It's temporary. I'll get back to it later. I'm just busy right now. This year is unusual. Things will calm down." And maybe they do. Sometimes life really is difficult. Sometimes responsibilities really do increase. The strange part is something else. You usually don't return to exactly who you were before. Some small adjustment remains, then another one remains, then another. And eventually, you aren't carrying one change. You're carrying hundreds of them. Tiny exchanges, tiny adaptations, tiny compromises. Each one so small that it barely deserves attention, until one day, they are all standing together. And suddenly you don't feel like yourself anymore. The person didn't disappear. The person accumulated changes. The architect of this channel once tried to think of a moment when everything changed. There wasn't one. No dramatic turning point, no single decision, no clear beginning. There were only small adjustments, a little more responsibility, a little less free time, a little less curiosity, a little more mental noise, a little less energy at the end of the day. Nothing looked significant, but looking backward, they no longer looked small. Because change often becomes visible only after enough small moments begin standing next to each other. Maybe that's why identity can feel so strange. Because we expect transformation to announce itself. We expect to remember the day everything changed. But sometimes there is no day. There are only thousands of ordinary moments. And each one quietly asks for something. A little more attention. A little more energy. A little more of you. Until eventually you begin looking at old photographs and wondering something that sounds impossible. How did I become someone else without ever noticing myself changing? At some point in adulthood, something subtle begins to happen. You stop asking yourself, what do I want? And you start asking, what needs to be done? At first, it seems completely reasonable. You have work, bills, family, people depending on you. Things that cannot simply wait. Responsibility is part of being an adult. There's nothing wrong with that. In many ways, responsibility gives life meaning. The strange part is that responsibility doesn't only change your schedule. It changes your attention. And eventually, it changes the questions you ask yourself. You begin organizing your days around problems that need solving, tasks that need completing, situations that need managing. And because these things are important, they slowly move to the center of your life. Little by little, your desires move outward. Your curiosity moves outward. Your interests move outward. Not because you stopped caring, because something else became more urgent. And urgency has a strange effect on identity. Urgent things repeatedly introduce themselves. Your own inner life often doesn't. Days become practical. Weeks become logistical. Months become operational. You become very good at functioning, very good at managing, very good at handling things. And one day someone asks, what do you do for yourself? And you realize the question feels unexpectedly difficult. Not because there is no answer, because you haven't asked yourself that question in a long time. Maybe years. Because somewhere along the way, your responsibilities became more familiar than your preferences. You know exactly what needs your attention. You know exactly who depends on you. You know exactly what problems must be solved. But your own interests begin feeling strangely distant, as if they belong to somebody else. The architect of this channel noticed something strange. It became easier to answer questions about responsibilities than questions about himself. What needs to be done? Immediate answer. What's the plan this week? Immediate answer. How are things going? Immediate answer. But questions like, what excites you lately? What are you curious about? What have you been enjoying recently? Those questions suddenly required thought. Not because there were no answers, because those questions had become less familiar. That realization felt much stranger than expected. Perhaps that's why adulthood can sometimes feel disorienting. You become increasingly competent at running your life and simultaneously become less certain about the person running it. You don't suddenly become someone else. You simply spend so much time managing life that you slowly stop visiting parts of yourself that don't have immediate responsibilities attached to them. And eventually, something strange happens. Your obligations know you better than you know yourself. At some point, without meaning to, you become extremely good at administration. You answer messages, you remember deadlines, you coordinate schedules, you solve problems, you plan ahead, you organize, you respond, you handle things, you keep everything moving. And people begin describing you in practical terms: reliable, responsible, dependable, efficient. You become the person who remembers, the person who manages, the person who takes care of things. Again, there is nothing wrong with any of this. In many ways, these are admirable qualities. The strange part is something else. The person who manages life is not always the same person who experiences it. Because administration has a very specific relationship with attention. It focuses on what needs to happen next, the next task, the next problem, the next deadline, the next conversation, the next thing that requires action. And eventually, something subtle begins happening. Your attention becomes almost entirely occupied by maintenance, maintaining work, maintaining relationships, maintaining schedules, maintaining finances, maintaining responsibilities, maintaining life itself. And maintenance is strange. It can consume enormous amounts of attention without producing a strong feeling of being alive. Days become full, but strangely difficult to remember. Weeks become productive, but strangely difficult to feel. You accomplish things, you solve things, you complete things. And sometimes, at the end of the day, you still have the strange feeling that you were present for everything except yourself. Because administration is incredibly useful, but it was never designed to become an identity. The architect of this channel noticed something uncomfortable. There were periods of life that looked completely functional from the outside. Everything was handled, everything was organized, everything was moving forward. And yet there was a strange question quietly sitting underneath all of it. When was the last time I felt genuinely interested in something? Not because it was useful, not because it needed attention, not because it solved a problem, just because it was interesting. The answer was not immediately obvious. That felt more disturbing than expected. Perhaps this is why so many adults say, "I don't know what happened to me." Because nothing happened. You simply became increasingly skilled at operating your life and gradually became less familiar with the person operating it. You didn't lose yourself all at once. You traded small pieces of yourself for things that needed to be done. And because each trade felt reasonable, you never noticed how much of yourself had quietly been exchanged. Maybe that's why this feeling can be so difficult to explain. Because most people can't point to the year they changed. They can't say, "It happened in 2022, or "It happened in 2024. Instead, the last few years often feel strangely compressed. One long season, one long project, one long period of being busy. You remember events, you remember problems, you remember responsibilities, but the years themselves become difficult to separate. Sometimes someone mentions something that happened 3 years ago, and your first reaction is, "That wasn't 3 years ago, that was recently." Then you do the math and realize it actually was. 3 years, maybe 4. And something about that realization feels unsettling. Because time didn't disappear. Your attention disappeared inside it. Think about how often adults describe periods of their lives. Things were crazy back then. That was a difficult season. I was just trying to survive. I had a lot going on. Those descriptions sometimes refer to entire years. Years become temporary periods. Years become something to get through. Years become administrative categories. Busy season, stressful period, complicated time. And maybe that's one of the strangest things adulthood does. It quietly changes your relationship with time. You stop living inside individual days. You start moving through operational periods, project, deadline, school year, financial situation, family situation, problem, recovery. Then another period begins, then another, then another. And eventually several years stand next to each other and feel like one continuous experience. One long state of management. One long state of responsibility. One long state of postponement. And perhaps that's why old photographs can feel so disorienting, because they force separation. This was a day. This was a moment. This was a version of me. The photograph creates boundaries that memory often no longer has. Suddenly you realize something uncomfortable. That person didn't disappear in one dramatic event. He slowly dissolved into years that all began feeling the same. The architect of this channel once looked at several photographs in chronological order. 1 year, then another, then another. Nothing dramatic happened. The face changed slightly, the surroundings changed slightly. Life moved forward. But something else became impossible to ignore. The years no longer felt separate. They felt like one continuous block, almost as if several versions of life had quietly merged together. That realization stayed around for a while, because it raised a strange question. If years can blend together this easily, how many versions of ourselves disappear inside them without us ever noticing? Maybe that's why people sometimes say, "I don't know where the time went." Perhaps time didn't go anywhere. Perhaps we simply became so occupied with managing life that entire versions of ourselves quietly passed through those years without ever receiving our full attention. And one day, looking at an old photograph, we suddenly realized something almost impossible to measure. It wasn't only time that passed. Someone passed through that time, and that someone no longer feels entirely familiar. Maybe that's why old photographs can sometimes feel strangely emotional. Not because they're sad, not because life was necessarily better, because they create a very unusual experience. For a moment, you meet someone you used to be. You look at the face. You recognize it immediately. You know exactly who this person is. You know his history. You know what happened before that day. You know what happened after. You know his mistakes. You know his fears. You know his plans. And yet something feels strangely unfamiliar, as if you're looking at someone you once knew very well, someone who slowly became a stranger. The strange part is that the person in the photograph would probably recognize you immediately. You look older, maybe more tired, maybe more serious, but they would know who you are. The difficult question is something else. Would they understand you? Would they understand the way you think now? The things you worry about, the things that occupy your attention, the things that consume your days? Would they understand how easily entire years now disappear into phrases like, "I've just been busy"? Would they understand why curiosity became less frequent, why rest became administration, why free time became recovery, why life slowly became something to manage? Maybe. Or maybe they would simply ask a question, a very simple question, one that somehow became difficult to answer. Are you happy? And perhaps the reason this question feels uncomfortable is because happiness was never really the point. The uncomfortable part is realizing that you don't entirely know who is being asked. Because the person in the photograph still feels like you, and also doesn't. It's both. You're looking at yourself, and you're looking at someone you no longer know how to become again. Maybe that's why the architect of this channel kept returning to that photograph. Not because he wanted to go back, not because he believed life used to be better. The photograph simply created a strange feeling. It felt less like remembering and more like sitting across from an old friend. Someone familiar, someone recognizable. Someone whose voice you can almost remember, and yet someone who no longer feels entirely accessible. That feeling is difficult to describe because it isn't exactly loss, it's something stranger. It's the realization that a version of you can slowly become unreachable while still existing in your memories. Perhaps that's what people mean when they say, I don't feel like myself anymore. Maybe they aren't saying that life became worse. Maybe they aren't saying that they want to go backward. Maybe they're describing something much quieter. The feeling that somewhere along the way, they stopped regularly meeting themselves and eventually became someone they know everything about, except how it feels to be them. Nobody stole your identity. Nobody took your personality away. Nobody woke up one morning and decided that you should become someone else. That's not how this usually happens. You become someone else gradually, quietly, administratively. One responsibility at a time, one adjustment at a time, one difficult season at a time. One thing that seemed temporary, one thing that needed to be done, one thing that couldn't wait. And because each exchange looked reasonable, you never noticed you were exchanging anything at all. A little more attention, a little less curiosity, a little more management, a little less presence, a little more responsibility, a little less availability to your own life. None of these changes looked important until one day they were standing together, and suddenly something felt unfamiliar. You. Perhaps that's why this feeling can be so unsettling, because there is no obvious loss, no clear ending, no dramatic goodbye. The person you remember didn't disappear. He slowly became someone else. And the old version of you never got a farewell. No ceremony, no final conversation, no moment of recognition. Just years, ordinary days, small adjustments, responsibilities, management, life. And then one evening you open an old photograph. You look at someone you know completely and realize you no longer know what it felt like to be him. Maybe that's the strange experience people are trying to describe when they say, I don't feel like myself anymore. Maybe they aren't lost. Maybe they simply haven't visited certain parts of themselves in a very long time. If you met the person you were 5 years ago, would you recognize them? Probably. The more difficult question is this: would they recognize the person you've become? And if the answer makes you unexpectedly quiet, perhaps this conversation was never really about changing. Perhaps it was about remembering that the old version of you never actually disappeared. You simply stopped meeting him. If you want to understand how it feels to slowly become unfamiliar to yourself, this is where we have that conversation. If you want to understand the systems that quietly shape who we become, visit Punchline Protocol. And if you want to step back and see the entire pattern from above, visit Debrief Protocol. Because sometimes, understanding begins with a strange feeling, and sometimes it begins with an old photograph. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation is yours. And perhaps somewhere inside an old photograph, a version of you is still waiting to be remembered.